Hey, come see us on tour. We're going to be in Los Angeles, Columbus, Ohio, Dayton, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Lexington, Kentucky, Burbank, California, and Honolulu. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.
This is Russell Dobular with Keaton Weiss from Due Dissidence filling in for Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore will be back Friday with Rumble Time, 7 p.m. Pacific Time with his special guest, Tucker Carlson. A very common comment that we've tried to be sensitive to is Gaza is not the only genocide, as horrible as it is. There are other genocides, literally genocides happening in the world. We've tried to cover the Congo and Sudan to draw some focus to that. Lately, there have been horrific new developments in Sudan, so we wanted to revisit that. So this is a young woman from Sudan describing some of the horrible suffering that the people are going through there right now.
Sudan is bleeding, and the rest of the world continues to look away. In Jazeera State, a heartbreaking massacre has unfolded as RSF inflict a campaign of terror on unarmed citizens, targeting them with brutal violence. Entire villages have been raided, with more than hundreds of people reported to be killed. The RSF is systematically abducting men and boys who are either forced into labor, coerced into the militia, or disappear without a trace. Women and girls already enduring unimaginable suffering have become targets of sexual violence by the RSF. Harrowing reports circulating of mass suicide of women out of fear of rape and abduction. Horrific acts of sexual violence by the RSF are conducted in public, often before family members, to instill a lasting sense of humiliation and horror. People are
So just a horrible situation there. Some say the RSF are funded by the UAE. I cannot confirm that, but I want to pass that along. So for anyone who doesn't know, just a little background on the Sudan Civil War, why it's happening, how it started. Fighting broke out in Khartoum, Sudan's capital, on 15th April 2023 as an escalating power struggle between the two main factions of the military regime finally turned deadly. On one side are the Sudanese armed forces, who remain broadly loyal to General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the country's de facto ruler. Against him are the paramilitaries of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, a collection of militia who follow the former warlord General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti. The RSF was founded by a former dictatorial ruler, Omar al-Bashir, as an Arab counterinsurgency militia. Bashir wanted to crush a rebellion in the region of Darfur that began more than 20 years ago due to the political and economic marginalization of the local population. Initially known as the Janjaweed, the RSF quickly became synonymous with widespread atrocities. In 2013, Bashir transformed the group into a semi-organized paramilitary force and gave its leaders military ranks before deploying it to crush a fresh rebellion in South Darfur. Hemeti's power struggle with Burhan can be traced back to 2019, when the RSF and regular military forces cooperated to oust Bashir from power. When attempts to transition to a democratic, civilian-led government faltered, many analysts felt an eventual showdown between Burhan and Hemeti was inevitable. What has been the human cost? The conflict has plunged Sudan into what the UN has described as one of the worst humanitarian nightmares in recent history. Tens of thousands have died, millions have been displaced, and hunger and disease are rife. According to the most recent figures, about 26 million people face severe food insecurity. Famine has been declared in the Zamzam displacement camp in Darfur. About 11.3 million people have been forced to flee the fighting, including nearly 2.95 million who have fled across the country's borders. Most have gone to Chad and South Sudan, where underfunded aid agencies say they are struggling to meet basic needs. A UN appeal for $1.51 billion to support Sudanese refugees and their hosts in the region through the end of the year remains just 27% funded. In its latest humanitarian update published on 1st October, the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said significant declines in vaccination rates and the destruction of health infrastructure resulting from the war means Sudan is grappling with multiple disease outbreaks, including cholera, malaria, dengue fever, measles, and rubella. An estimated 3.4 million children under the age of 5 are at high risk of epidemic diseases, according to UNICEF. The conflict has also robbed huge numbers of an education. More than 90% of the country's 19 million school-aged children are unable to access formal education. Schools have been targeted in airstrikes, occupied by armed groups, and used to store weapons. So that is some background on the war. And these are later developments now. New wave of massacre as atrocities hit dozens of villages. A new surge of mass killings and sexual violence has left hundreds of civilians dead in dozens of Sudanese villages in a farming region south of Khartoum, civil society groups say. The attacks were committed over the past 5 days by the RSF, the militia group that has battled Sudan's military across the country since the war erupted last year. Videos on social media showed scores of dead bodies wrapped in funeral shrouds. In one of the villages in Gezira State, a farming region and traditional breadbasket of Sudan before the war, the village assaults were retribution for the defection of a top RSF commander, Abu Akla Kaikal, who surrendered to the Sudanese military last week, the civil society group said. One village alone, Al-Sahira, suffered at least 124 deaths and 100 injuries when the RSF attacked it, Sudanese activists said. An independent Sudanese media outlet, Ayin, reported that the RSF set up guns and artillery weapons on village rooftops and fired indiscriminately at civilians. Hala al-Karib, a Sudanese women's rights activist who leads the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, estimated that nearly 1,000 civilians may have been killed by the RSF in Gezira and neighboring Sennar State in recent days. Quote, over the past week, the RSF has conducted horrible war crimes that are close to acts of genocide in our view, she told an online media briefing on Saturday. Despite a lack of internet access in the region, her group was able to document 25 cases of sexual violence in less than 3 days, and it has received reports of women dying by suicide because of gang rapes that they suffered, Ms. Al-Karib said. The RSF attacks have also targeted the region's agricultural infrastructure by looting villages, burning farmland, and destroying irrigation canals. Quote, I strongly believe these acts would not continue to happen if not for the silence of the international community, she told the briefing organized by the Sudanese American Physicians Association. There's been even worse reporting breaking today of women mass abducted, of girls as young as 9 and women as old as 74 being sexually assaulted, of boys being abducted and forced into the military. The UN has voiced concern at evidence that foreign countries are shipping weapons to both sides in the war. Those concerns were reinforced last week when a Sudanese military cargo plane crashed in Darfur region with 2 Russian crew members on board. The armed attacks are far from the only threat in Sudan after 18 months of war. Sudan has become both the world's largest hunger crisis and the world's worst displacement crisis, UN agencies say. More than 11 million people, nearly a quarter of Sudan's population, have been forced to flee their homes, taking shelter inside the country or across borders in neighboring countries. The Zamzam refugee camp in North Darfur has been officially declared a famine zone, and 14 other regions across Sudan are teetering on the brink of famine, the UN Children's Agency and UN Refugee Agency said in a joint statement on Friday. There are 3.7 million children under 5 projected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition this year alone, who are in urgent need of life-saving treatment, the statement said. These children are already weakened by hunger. If not reached soon, these children are 11 times more likely to die from preventable diseases than their healthier peers inside Sudan. So I did a little research because very often you see a segment like this. The real question is, well, what am I supposed to do? Why are you showing me this? This is horrible, but I feel helpless. So there are charities that are trying to alleviate some of the suffering. I did do some research on their legitimacy so that you're not paying for a CEO's salary. So this is the International Rescue Organization. They are operating in Sudan. They're among the few groups that are. They have a very good rating as a charity. Of course, Doctors Without Borders. They're a great organization that you can donate to specifically for this cause. And then if you do want to research charities and their quality that are operating in this zone, Charity Navigator here has a complete list of groups that are working in Sudan, their rating, and you can click in and get details about the group. So if anybody wants to try to help or donate, that's probably the best thing you can do.
What about Jews for Sudan? What
Jews
about
for
that? What about that charity? How reputable is that one?
That is strangely, that group doesn't operate in Palestine.
Yeah, interesting.
They only operate in Sudan.
There was video this week of Code Pink activists disrupting a Bernie Sanders event for Kamala. And, what occurred to me in watching that video was that it is social democracy really emblemized in one video, because you got Bernie up there talking about, we're going to stand up to the billionaires, and the crowd is screaming, talk about Gaza, talk about Palestine, and he's unfazed because they're up on the balcony, you can barely hear, where the landlords are ripping us off, and so it's like,
right.
you have the people whose consciousness you played a part in, if not elevating, at least stimulating, right? With his 2 campaigns. They're now on a different page. They're now screaming about foreign policy. They're screaming about imperialism. They're screaming about the sort of the footprint of misery that we have just kind of stamped upon the world. And he's acting as if he can't hear them. I mean, literally in that example, he's acting as if he can't hear them. And in this example, we covered a Sudan piece on our show a few months back where there was one guy who was being interviewed and who said that the world has mostly forgotten this because so many eyes are on Gaza, which is kind of this weird thing, because you could look at it from 30 miles back even further than how we look at things here, where you have activists screaming about Gaza and there are probably millions of people screaming at us to pay attention to them, right? And then if you step back even further, there's even larger concentric circle of people who are screaming for eyes on them. It is a sobering reminder of how insulated we are here.
Yes. The more you learn about what horrors are going on in the world, largely to keep the West prosperous and well supplied with the raw materials it needs for its economies, the more a lot of the social democrat concerns seem trivial. When you see something like this, can you imagine? Look at these people praying over this. Most Americans, this is so remote to what most people in the West could handle, their minds would snap like an eggshell if they experienced something like this, these horrors that are commonplace in these regions, and we're worried about free weed. I mean, I'm for it, but the more you see of what our prosperity, such as it is, really depends upon, the more you feel that as a person of good conscience, you have to have a more global perspective.
Yeah, and a more global perspective puts a lot in perspective here at home. So, I mean, this is where I'm likely to sound like a real communist, but like you have people advocating, no, we need more prosperity here. You need the American dream here. It has to be easier to become a billionaire here. Really?
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Don't you think the answer might be, especially when you broaden your view of things out and you put everything in a truly global context? Does a part of you not say, hey, we are already at the top of the income level, at the top of the lifestyle level, so to speak? We already live in relative luxury, right? Does there not have to be a leveling out,
right,
in order for any sort of justice to be done, right? Does there have to be some leveling out of that, or do we just say no? Actually, the problem here is that in America, it's too hard to get rich. Yeah. That's really the problem in the world.
That's really
is that the communists are stopping us from achieving our dream here in America. It's my dream to have a 3-car garage or a second house or an in-ground pool. That's my dream. How dare you deny me that dream? Does that come first? I mean, it's a question people have to ask themselves. Look, everybody's a product of their environment to a certain extent. It's not the fault of people if you're born into a certain environment and that's all you know, then that's all you would care about, right? So it's not like it's not a failing of people, but stories like this put a lot in perspective that is very rarely interrogated in a serious way.
Yes, and if you really want to see the underlying racism at the core of Western thought, let's face it, the way that they get around taking responsibility for this is to cover up how much our interference in these societies and these governments have to do with the destabilization of those regions. And we chalk it up to a racial inferiority. These days, they can't put it in quite those terms, but that's what they mean when they say, well, their institutions are dysfunctional. How did they get that way? How did they get that way, and why did they stay that way? And then you'll find out about a plane with CIA agents on it crashing, or Russian agents, as are mentioned there. Or there was another, when I was researching this, I didn't have enough time to really delve into it. There were guys with UAE IDs bringing weapons in. But then you're going to blame them. There's something wrong with them when all of these more powerful, richer nations are all doing everything they can to make sure that they can't manage their own resources and thereby demand a fair price for them. That's what's really going on in most of these countries. I'm not saying, well, if we leave, it's going to be a paradise, but most of the problems they would have after we left would be the legacy of what we left them with.
Hey, come see us on tour. We're going to be in Los Angeles, Columbus, Ohio, Dayton, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Lexington, Kentucky, Burbank, California, and Honolulu. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.